Welcome back for week number 4. This is Explorer's Guide to the Word. So far, we have covered reading and studying your Bible, but this week we're taking a turn. We are going to be looking at character studies. Now, we know from week 2, one of the ways that you can read is to look for something specific as you're reading, right? And maybe you do a deep dive on a key word. Week number 3, we learned about the concordance, the Strong's Concordance, and we can use that to look up original Greek. Okay, so week 3 gave us that Strong's Concordance, but this week we're going to look at something different than just a word or a topic. We want to be able to look at a biblical person, okay, a character from the Bible. So this could be any particular person that you want to learn about. Okay, so maybe you're reading through James and you wonder, is this James the disciple of Jesus? You should have wondered that. You should have been asking yourself the 5 W's and an H, right? Who, what, where, why, when, and how. So like, for instance, who is the author of this book? Who wrote this? Which James is this that we're talking about? There's several Jameses in the Bible. Which one is this one? Was it James the Apostle? Was it James, the brother of Jesus? Was it a different James? Class, who do you think it was? Hey, James, the brother of Jesus. And there is an actual photo of him. Everybody's laughing. What? I'm really good with the internet. I found this photo of him created with AI, this real photo of James the Just. That was his nickname. And as my good friend Abraham Lincoln used to say, don't believe everything you find on the internet. Okay. So James was nicknamed the Just. Maybe you want to know more about this James, so we could do a deep dive on the person of James. In fact, that is exactly what we're going to do in class tonight. I'm going to do a deep dive on James. So for your homework for week 4, you can't pick James, but you can pick any other biblical character you want, except for this James, because I'm giving you all the information tonight. So that would be cheating. Okay, so James the Just. Who is he? Well, originally he was a skeptic, and then he turned into a believer. This is kind of interesting. Now, why might we want to care about studying a particular person of the Bible? Why not just read the Bible? Why would we actually study a character? Well, because these are real historical people, and they have problems just like we have. Some of them are worse than we have. You'll see how James kind of ended up. And there's a lot we can learn from these guys. And so sometimes even if you're studying a guy, maybe Judas Iscariot, maybe you learn what not to be like, right? And so other times we see ways that we should copy them. Paul says, be like me as I'm like Christ. So we should emulate people as they're like Jesus. And it's nice to see other people that are striving to be like Jesus. Pretty cool. So how do we do a character study? Well, here's how, okay? You need... Yes, Ashley, you got a question.
Yeah. Can it be anyone in the Bible or just people?
Anyone in the Bible, but we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. Okay, I'll give you a little bit more information on who you can pick in a little bit, okay? So if you go to week 4, you'll see a suggested list of characters that you might consider, okay? Some of these might require a little more work than others, but we'll talk about that in a minute, okay? Now, here's the deal. You are going to first find all the primary source references to the character, meaning every single time the Bible says this guy's name, you're looking it up. So Jesus is not your first choice here, okay, guys? You cannot finish that by next week. There's no chance. Don't pick Peter. Don't pick Moses unless you want to read every book of Moses and all major portions of the New Testament talking about Moses. Like, it's not going to be doable, right? So I gave you some suggestions for people that you might consider. Octavian, and that's Caesar Augustus, right? Or Caiaphas, or Herod Antipas, Herod the Great. There's lots of Herods, so if you pick a Herod, you're going to have to sort through every reference to Herod to figure out which one's the right one. Herodias, that could be one. Or Philip the Tetrarch. There's Philip the Apostle. There's a couple Philips. If you pick somebody with a common name, again, it makes it a little more challenging. So picking somebody like John, I don't advise that, right? That Pontius Pilate, that could be good. Or Salome, that could be cool, right? Tiberius Caesar, Gamaliel the Elder. These are just ideas. If you have a favorite person, and ladies, maybe you should pick a lady. I don't know. It's possible to do somebody like Deborah. There's multiple, references, but you could find different ladies in the Bible that don't have tons of references. If you do Ruth, you're gonna have to read the entire book. And then maybe I think she might be mentioned in Hebrews. But other than that, maybe you could do Ruth. But there's multiples. So you can look and pick your own person. I'm not telling you who you got to pick. Just don't bite off more than you can chew. All right. Now, let's see. So as an example, we're just going to look at James today. So James the Just. A quick Google search might yield this information. Okay? He's the half-brother of Jesus. Why do we say he's a half-brother? Yeah, different dads, right? Yeah, same mom, different dads, right? So the 2nd century historian Hegesippus, recorded in Eusebius, he noted that James was so devoutly committed to righteousness that he got this nickname, the Just. Man, that's pretty cool. He was also called the bulwark of the people. What the heck is a bulwark? It's like a defensive wall. Okay, it's so a side of a ship could be called a bulwark. It's the defensive portion of a ship or something. So James would go to bat for people. In fact, he was known very much for praying for the sins of the people. Very interesting. So this is a Google search. You definitely can use Google to give you a clue of where you might start with somebody. But you want to find something like Blue Letter Bible, and you want to look up every single reference in Blue Letter Bible on your person. So if you wanted to find Gamaliel, you would just go to Blue Letter Bible, put in the search field, Gamaliel, and then see all the verses. And there may not be a ton. This is actually as difficult or as easy as you make it. So I want you to learn the process here, but I don't want it to be so simple that you're like, Gamaliel, oh cool, there's 2 verses. I'm done. Like, maybe that's too easy, but maybe not. Maybe that's all you got time for because you're making up for week 3 or something. I don't know. It's up to you. But try to go through the process and really think through the questions, okay? Read every day specifically, because even though a lot of the days repeat, it's not always completely one-to-one between each day. So every day I specifically chose the homework on purpose. So read it. Make sure you got your thinking cap on as you're going through. So we're starting with the primary source, the Bible. That's the first thing we're going to do. You can do a cheat and look just briefly like, who is James on Google and see what it says, right? If you want. That's not officially part of your research. That just gives you maybe a clue of where you might be going. The Bible is going to be your first source. Okay, so here we go. Here are some major sources, references to James, the brother of Jesus. Here we go. Matthew 13:55. The Pharisees are talking, is not this the carpenter's son? They're talking about Jesus. His mother, isn't she called Mary? His brothers, James, Joseph, Simon, Judas. Isn't this Jesus? We know who he is. Here, James is just mentioned as one of the brothers of Jesus. Why would we write this down? Because this is talking about James. You're writing down everything, even if it seems completely like it's in passing. You write down every reference. Mark 6:3, same thing. Same story, talking about his brothers here with us, James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon. Interesting, they kind of changed the order and even the spelling for Joseph to Joseph. Judas is Jude, the guy who wrote the book of Jude. It's cool. It's only 1 chapter, but I mean, he got a book too. James wrote 5 chapters. He wrote a bigger book. That's cool. And his sisters are here. Oh, interesting. So there's some sisters also. Ooh, okay. What about this one? 1 Corinthians 15:7. This is talking about after Jesus rose from the dead. It says, then he appeared to James and then to all the apostles. Interesting. He appeared to James. And early traditions actually tell us that's how his brother came to faith. Because he was a skeptic. We're going to see that in a moment. He was a skeptic originally. I mean, he doesn't believe in his older brother. How many of you guys got an older sibling in your family? A lot of you. And you're like, man, they're not the Messiah. Come on, give me a break. And James was like, no way. I live with this dude. He's not the Messiah. And then when he rose from the dead, he's like, huh, huh. That's hard to refute, right? Look at Galatians 1:19. It says, this was when Paul came. They were warning him, don't go to Jerusalem. And he's like, I'm going anyway. And he goes to Jerusalem. And he talks about his visit. He says, I did not see another one of the apostles except James, the Lord's brother. So this shows he met with James when he was in Jerusalem. He calls him the Lord's brother. Okay, what other ones do we have? We've got Galatians 2:12. This one is Paul's letter to the Galatians, talking about some of the Judaizers who were sort of in the group. They were basically people who said, you need to be saved and keep the law. Okay? It's confusing to the Gentile believers who are like, so now we got to be Jewish and a Christian? Is that how this works? And so this verse actually is showing, it says, some men came from James. He used to eat with the Gentiles. And when they came, I think this one was talking about Peter, if I'm not mistaken. He began to withdraw and he separated himself, fearing those from the circumcision. So there were some very well-respected people coming in from James's group, and Peter quit eating with the Gentiles because he's over there with barbecue on his face, and he's like, oh, oops. I'm not trying not to. He's trying to kind of play both sides, right? He's showing like, I'm a Jew, I'm a really good Jew, and wiping off the whiskers with barbecue, right? And these guys are going like, hey, you can eat all things, it's fine. But he and this is why Paul confronted him and was talking about that. But the point of this referencing James is showing that James was over this group of Jewish Christians, and their opinion obviously had some pretty significant weight. Okay, how about this one? Acts 12:17. But motioning to them with his hand to be silent, he described to them how the Lord had led him out of the prison. Peter's talking. He says, report these things to James and the brothers. Then he left and went to another place. So Peter is miraculously released from prison. You remember that? An angel comes in, and Peter thinks it's a vision. He gets to the outside, the angel disappears, and Peter's like, guess that's not a vision. He just strolls on back home. There he goes. Like, cool, yeah, casual walking, man. And he says, tell this to James and the brothers. And again, it's showing James is some kind of significant leader of some kind of group here. In Acts 15, we're not going to read all these. Basically, in these scriptures, James is playing this key presiding role over a council of Jerusalem. What was happening at this council? They were trying to figure out a final decision about Gentile converts. Do they have to keep the law? And what they decided was, let's make them abstain from like fornication, because that literally is sin. And also let's make sure that they're not eating like meat sacrificed to idols. They shouldn't be doing that. It's not a sin, but so that we can have fellowship with them. It's going to cause the Jews to have a real problem. So just tell the Gentiles, don't do it out of respect for us. And then we can have kind of what we call table fellowship. We can have a good relationship and work together. We believe the same thing about the gospel, but some of these things we might have some differences of opinion. They're not salvic, meaning they don't pertain to salvation. But if we're going to be hanging out with them, like we don't want them eating meat. It's kind of offensive for us, right? And so this James was one of these key figures making these judgment calls. So that's pretty cool. Acts 21:18. Following day, Paul went in with us to James. All the elders were present. Paul is visiting James. Again, he's a leader of, the Jerusalem church. He's a significant crowd of believers there. James is that leader of that church. The book of James, that's an entire reference to James. Okay. Also, Jude 1. Jude was whom? Another brother. He was brother of James. Here he says he's a bondservant of Jesus Christ and brother of James. To those who are the called, beloved God the Father, kept for Jesus, yada, yada. So he's giving an intro to his book, and he refers to himself the brother of James. He's a bondservant of Jesus. He's also a brother of Jesus. But he calls himself a brother of James because James is a little bit more well-known in the Jerusalem church, and Jude's just like, James is my brother, right? So it depends on how we introduce ourselves sometimes. If I'm talking to people in Kidman circles, and they know maybe Miss Tara, Miss Tanya, and they're like, oh, you're Tanya's husband. Like, right? But then if you're in magic circles and they meet Ashley and they're like, oh, you're Matt's daughter, right? Like it's a relationship. Oh, you're Emily, you're Matt's daughter. Oh, yeah, we know who you are. Or if they're talking to Tanya, oh, you're Matt's wife, right? And so it depends on your circles. And so he's showing here, this is Christian circles, and he's like, everybody knows James. I'm James's brother. I'm cool too, right? Like, so that's kind of what he's doing here. So this was Jude. So as we're looking at direct references to James in the scriptures, then after you found them all and you wrote them all down, then you next go for indirect reference. What would an indirect reference be? Well, anytime it says the brothers of Jesus. Is James one of those? Yes. Okay, so let's see. What does this say? Look at John 7, 3 through 5. Look at the final line there. Not even his brothers believed in him. They didn't believe in him. He starts doing public miracles, and they're like, nah, this ain't it. He's not it. He ain't him, right? His brothers did not believe in him, not at first. Look at Acts 1:14. All these were continually devoting themselves with one mind to prayer, along with the women and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and with his brothers. So after the ascension, when Jesus rose and went back to heaven, these are now specifically called out that they're together in the upper room and they're praying with Mary, with the apostles. It's great. Okay, how about this one? 1 Corinthians 9:5. So this one is talking about Paul's talking here about brothers of the Lord who are traveling with their wives on missionary journeys. And so it's possible James could have had a brother. It doesn't say that he does, but we know some brothers of Jesus had brothers. And it calls out Cephas specifically, Peter. So from this verse, by the way, something important logically to point out, it is only possible that James had a wife. We have no idea. This verse doesn't tell us. Okay? It just tells us that he's one of these apostles. They're traveling along. You'd have to look at the rest of the passage. I just gave you a quick snippet here. But there's brothers of the Lord who are traveling with their wives, okay? And you don't know if James has a wife here, okay? One early historian specifically mentioned James, I think he was 96 when he died. Who knows if that's true? But this early historian says, yeah, he was 90, 92 or 96, something crazy, and he died a virgin. He never got married. So maybe that's true. We don't know, right? And we don't have enough information from this passage to make a determination one way or another. So you can't just automatically assume, yeah, well, James had a wife. Well, we don't know. So it's talking about it in plural, but we do know that he's traveling around in this case. James 2:12, John 2:12. James would have been among these brothers. So this is right after Jesus turned water into wine. Then they went to Capernaum, he and his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there. So they all are traveling as this kind of big caravan. James would have seen this. He sees these miracles. He doesn't believe in Jesus with all of these miracles he sees. Okay, primary sources, that is the Bible, and we're looking at direct references to James, and then we just saw indirect references. What do you think would be next? What should we research next? Which kind? Exactly, secondary sources. And I would call these sources extra biblical sources. These are sources outside of the Bible. Okay, it doesn't mean that they're right or wrong or whatever. They're just outside of the Bible. So what might we find? Well, anything that's mentioning James the Just. So these are sources. Specifically, the best ones are going to be around the time period that James lived, or very shortly after. So you're looking for early historians, Josephus, Eusebius, these kind of guys, Josephus, who we've lost his work. It's only quoted in Eusebius. So you can find still Hegesippus, but you have to go to Eusebius to see what Hegesippus says. Anyway, There'll be eyewitness accounts or early accounts, and so they're written around the same time period. There's eyewitness accounts. So here's an example. Okay, Josephus. Christians love to talk about Josephus because he does talk about Jesus. Um, and so this is great. It's an extra biblical source that references Jesus, but he also talks about many people. He was a very famous ancient historian. So we can't judge these ancient historians by the same standards as we might a modern day historian. It's different. The Gospels are incredibly reliable and accurate historical accounts of what happened 2,000 years ago, but they didn't write exactly the same way maybe that we would today. They wrote very, very well, and it captures exactly what we need for it. Josephus was a little bit after, but it was very close to this time period. He wrote a very famous work. It's called Antiquities of the Jews. Huge work. And Antiquities 29:1, he says about James that he is the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. His name was James. It also mentions that James was stoned to death by order of high priest Ananus, I think it was. Ananus ben Ananus. So his dad was Ananus and his name is Ananus. And so when he stoned James, he had James killed, and it angered the Roman procurator at the time. His name is Lucius Albinus. It also angered local king Herod Agrippa, and they ended up removing Ananus from his post over the whole James matter. So he kills James, but he loses his job. James loses his life. So a little bit worse, but you know. Now this shows this is not just mentioned in the biblical sources, though that should be sufficient, but it's also mentioned in extra biblical sources. James was a real historical person. And now we know a little bit about how he died. That's not recorded in the Bible. Again, we think this is how he died based on Josephus, but you can't hold Josephus on equal footing with the Bible. We know the Bible's perfect and true, so we can trust that. Josephus would have to go, probably he's not making this up, right? Like he's talking to people, he knows what happened, and so he accurately recorded this. But you got to take it a little bit more cautious than you would even the scriptures. So what do you do next? Well, you can also Google to find more sources. Now, Google can reveal other extra biblical mentions of James, like I mentioned Hegesippus. This was a 2nd century historian that was quoted in Eusebius. Eusebius wrote this work. It's called Church History. And Hegesippus provides details on the life and death of James. He says James was a vegetarian. He says he didn't drink alcohol. He never got a haircut. Okay, so we wouldn't have a lot in common, right? And so he was known for praying so much that his knees looked like camel knees because they were so calloused, because he always was on his knees, and they nicknamed him Old Camel Knees. Man, yeah, how'd you like that nickname? But he was also called the Just. Now, there was a sect. You know, a sect is like this group of people. So there was the 7 sects who challenged James about Jesus being God. Because James is like, yeah, Jesus is God. My bro, he's God. And they're like, what? You know, he's saying, no, Jesus is God. So they start challenging him about this. They take him to the top of the temple and they say, announce to all the people that Jesus is just a man. And James was like, let's go. They go to the top of the temple. He's like, they want me to tell you Jesus is just a man. And I'm here to tell you Jesus is the Son of Man, and he will come again in the clouds with great power. And he starts preaching. They get furious and they chunk him off the top of the temple, where he falls 100-ish feet and somehow survives. He gets onto his knees and starts praying, God forgive them. And they get furious and start stoning him. And his death blow comes by a guy that beats clothes out with a club, and he's beating the clothes. He takes his club and smashes him over the head and kills him. So that is how James met his end, which still fits Josephus claiming about the stoning, but Hegesippus gives us a few more details that were very possibly true. We even have, pictures of this in early church tradition, etc. So, pretty crazy. Clement of Alexandria, also quoted in Eusebius, he claims that James was taught by Jesus. He was also a pillar in the church. We know this. And then there's other apocryphal texts like the Gospel according to Hebrews, the preaching and martyrdom of James, the pseudo-Clementine homilies. There's all kinds of other ones. I didn't look at every single reference for us. This is just an example. But if I were going to be doing this study, I should go look at every one of those references to James and see what other kind of information that it might yield. Now, and more exist even than these. But there's a caution here, okay? If, and you probably will, use Google or AI to help in your research, say, and it's not, list every reference to James. It's not quite that, but it's what other sources outside of the Bible might talk about James. I use Google for that. I used Gemini. It's an AI thing, and it gives me all these really good things, and it tells me what they say, and I'm like, great. I start typing it up, and I'm like, but trust but verify, right? So I looked, and I'm like, oh look, Josephus 20.9.1, and I open Josephus 29.1 and search for James, and blip, there it is. Is that what it says? Actually, yes, it's perfect. And I'm like, well, it's claiming this. And then I went and researched the exact source, because all of these ancient sources are available free online. You can find just about anything. So just go verify, and don't just think like, well, there it is. I'm sure AI is right, because it can hallucinate answers, right? It can make stuff up, and we don't need the hallucination. So the first principle is look at the Bible. Why would we start at the Bible? This should be fairly obvious, but why? Give me some reasons why we would start at the Bible. Yes, Olivia.
The only thing we can trust to be completely true at all times.
Completely true. Great. Okay. Why else? Emmy. Yeah, you're going to get a lot of information because it's a biblical character. Go to the primary source, right? So, but anything extra biblical, it doesn't mean it's automatically right or wrong. Just don't hold it on the equal footing as the scriptures themselves. So, you're going to consult the Bible first. That's your primary source. Secondary source, you go to extra biblical writings. Third source, you can look up modern day biographies. You can look up modern things. John Piper, what did he say? Or whatever. And you pick your favorite preacher and see if they wrote a book on your character. Highly unlikely if you pick one of these characters that I suggested here. They're very minor characters, some of these. Pontius Pilate, a little more well known. Maybe you could find a biography on Pontius Pilate. Who knows? But that's another option, right? So here is our method for week 4. You're going to look up every primary reference to your character, okay? Just reviewing this. I've said this, but you're looking up every primary reference. And then after you've got your list of sources and you've written all of it out, then you can start analyzing your person, right? You're asking the 5 W's and an H about the passage. You want to analyze their lives. What did you learn about them? Who did they interact with? What character qualities did you find out about their lives? Did anything contradict what Scripture said? If you start looking in another place, did it contradict the Bible? Ask those 5 W's and an H. For James, maybe you would ask, what would make a skeptic completely change his mind? And then go from not accepting his brother as Christ to literally being a leader in the Christian church and being thrown off a temple and murdered for his faith in his brother. Something drastic happened. What best explains this, right? And then the last thing that you would do, you've got a list of character traits, you can do extra biblical references. The last thing you would do is maybe look to modern sources. That could be commentaries or biographies, whatever. But read critically. Don't just assume because somebody wrote a book about it that they're right, okay? You got to compare it, think about it. Maybe they give you another facet. You're like, I didn't think about that. It could be true, but keep your thinking cap on. Now, that's it. I told you, semi-short lesson today, but the homework could be a little more challenging, all right? It could be as challenging as you make it, but you're essentially what I'm wanting you to do here, okay? You are essentially doing the research required to write a college paper. You're not writing the paper, but you're doing all of the research right before you start writing the paper. So you're finding all your sources, you're documenting everything, you're gleaning all the stuff you can, you're critically thinking about who was this person? What were they like? Do I want to be like them? Do I want to be unlike them? Did they make good decisions? Did they make bad decisions? Did they interact with Jesus? Did anything change in their life? What's their storyline look like? Tell us everything you can about this person. And you should be able, and nobody's going to have to do this, but you should theoretically next week come back in, stand up and say, I researched Gamaliel. Let me tell you about his life. And give us all the details about Gamaliel or whoever you picked. You should theoretically be able to do that. I'm not going to make anybody do that. But that's the idea. So you've done all the research, you just never finished writing the paper. Does that sound fair? Okay, so nobody's having to write a paper, but that's kind of where we're headed with this. You want to do the research for it. So I'm showing you how to critically study a character of the Bible. Does anybody have any questions so far on all of your studies and your homework or anything? Anything standing out that you're like, I wish I could ask Mr. Matt? That's a great question. She says, when we write this for week 4, do we have to state our sources? Absolutely. Now, you do not need to write them like in Turabian or MLA or whatever, kind of Chicago style. You don't have to actually do a formal research paper style citation, but you need to be able to say, Josephus said this, or whoever said this. Write down, you saw how I wrote down every single biblical reference. Write down the verse and where you found the information. The absolutely bare minimum, you should be able to do that. Okay? And ideally, you're going to be like, I saw Josephus, here's a description. And you don't have to say, it's nice if you give me 20, period, 9, period, 1. I'm like, oh, I can go see exactly where you found this. That shows me a little extra, but you could just say, Josephus said this. Eusebius said this, or whatever. Okay, but yes, good question. You need to cite your source. That's important. Okay, any other questions on that? Yes, Carol.
Can you just clarify with the name like James? How did you know that those verses were about the James you were talking about?
Oh, that's a great question. So this is going to require, that's why I'm saying it's beyond what you may want to do for this week, but you're going to have to figure this out from context, from additional cross-references, like parallel passages that we talked about, and then look up, figure out who you think, and then the final step after you've compiled your stuff, you start consulting commentaries, and if every major Bible scholar out there agrees about something, you're like, I might have missed that one. Maybe you missed it, right? You go back and start going, why does everybody think this is James the Just and not James the disciple or apostle of Jesus? Why are they talking about James the Just in these references by every major biblical scholar? Why do they all think that? What am I missing, right? And fair warning, you're gonna miss some stuff. It's okay. But that's why we study and we start going, and I want to look up what I want to look up the why. Why do you guys think this? I see that you all agree. Why do you all agree? How do you get that? And I had a couple of those because it was like appeared to James and the apostles. I'm like, how do you know that's his brother? Why didn't they just call out James as one of the apostles? And some of the rationale there, some of those references, as I thought about it and did study, it's like usually who's the guy that they normally call out as the leader of the apostles? Peter, right? Go tell Peter and the apostle. So James was a leader in the church. This was a different reference. It's interesting. So that was a quick aside, but yes, great question. So if you have something a little more challenging, you pick, John. You're like, oh, which John are we talking about? John Mark, John the Baptist, John the Apostle. Like, what are we doing? So you're going to have to start thinking through that. And then that just requires way more reading. So, yep. But it's possible you could do that this week. All right, any other finals? Kevin.
When they're writing out the references, are they writing like the reference and the whole verse?
I would write, it's a great question. You can write as much or as little as you like. I would like to see the reference and the point. So if it just says, James is the brother of Jesus, Mark, whatever, and that's what it says. It may say more in that verse, but figure out what you found from your character in that verse. Some of these are so short, there's so few references to them, you could write out the whole verse. It's not going to kill you. You don't have to, but you need to write out what you learn about the person, the description, and don't, try not to leave any details out there. So it's a good question. I'm not too much of a stickler on some of those details. I'm looking, did you make an actual effort to have writing on every page, engaging with the material? Are you trying to do the homework, or are you trying to get by doing the bare minimum? Like, you are making no effort, right? So, but if you show any effort, I'm going to probably give you the benefit of the doubt. So that's what we're doing there for that.